Unwanted guest, my sister announced into the microphone at her wedding reception. Finally, someone printed the truth. The ballroom exploded with laughter so loud that for a moment I thought maybe I had misunderstood what was happening. Maybe I had read the place card wrong. Maybe Vanessa was joking in that cruel little way she always had, and everyone else simply didn't realize how sharp her words could be. But then I looked toward my parents. My mother covered her mouth with manicured fingers, trying to hide her smile behind a crystal champagne glass. My father leaned back in his chair, shaking silently with laughter, his tuxedo shoulders trembling beneath the soft golden lights hanging over the dance floor. And just like that, at 67 years old, I realized I had spent my entire life begging for love from people who enjoyed humiliating me. I stood there frozen beside table 12, while waiters carrying filet mignon and glasses of white wine slipped around me like I was invisible. The place card was still in my hand. Thick ivory paper. Elegant gold lettering. Unwanted guest. Not sister of the bride. Not Eleanor Whitmore. Just unwanted. Around me, the ballroom at the Grand Crescent Hotel looked like something out of a bridal magazine. White roses climbed across the walls in tall arrangements nearly 6 feet high. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. A string quartet played softly near the marble staircase while 200 guests pretended not to stare at me directly. I felt every pair of eyes in the room without looking up once. Vanessa stood at the center of it all in a fitted satin gown with tiny pearls stitched along the sleeves. She looked radiant, victorious. Her silver blonde hair fell over one shoulder exactly the way she'd probably spent 3 hours planning. Even at 62, my younger sister knew how to command attention the second she entered a room. She always had. "Oh, don't look so serious, Eleanor," she said, smiling into the microphone while guests chuckled nervously around her. "It's only a joke." A joke. That word had followed me my entire life. Every insult was a joke. Every exclusion was a misunderstanding. Every cruel little wound was somehow my fault for being too sensitive. I forced my lips into something resembling a smile and slowly sat down at the edge of the table. The chair felt cold beneath me. Across the room, I noticed a giant digital screen playing childhood photos of Vanessa and her new husband, Gerald. Picture after picture faded across the screen in soft romantic transitions. Vanessa at 16. Vanessa at college. Vanessa opening Christmas presents. Vanessa holding our parents between smiling cheeks at family vacations in Cape Cod and Lake Tahoe. Then something strange hit me like ice water down my spine. I wasn't in any of them. Not one. I stared harder. There should have been dozens of photos with me standing beside her. Birthdays. Family reunions. Thanksgiving dinners. But every image had been cropped so carefully that there was no trace of me left at all. My chest tightened slowly. Deliberately. They had removed me from the family memories themselves. A waiter stopped beside me offering champagne. I shook my head quietly. My hands no longer felt steady enough to hold a glass. At the next table, 2 women whispered while pretending to study the centerpiece. "Is that really her sister?" one asked softly. "Can you imagine?" I lowered my eyes to the untouched bread plate in front of me. There was a time when this kind of thing would have shattered me immediately. 10 years ago, I might have cried in the restroom or driven home shaking so hard I could barely see the road. But grief changes you. Loneliness changes you. And after decades of being treated like an outsider in my own family, something inside me had simply gone cold instead of breaking. Vanessa resumed smiling for photographs while guests gathered around her table. My mother hurried over to fix the train of her dress. My father clapped Gerald on the shoulder like he'd personally negotiated world peace. No one looked toward me again. I sat quietly through the salad course listening to forks clink against china, while memories I had buried years ago slowly rose to the surface. Vanessa locking me outside the house when we were children because she thought it was funny. My mother laughing when I cried. My father telling me, "Your sister just has a stronger personality." Vanessa announcing my divorce at Thanksgiving before I had told anyone because she wanted to save me the trouble. Every humiliation wrapped in a smile. Every cruelty dismissed as humor. And somehow, every single time, I had been expected to apologize for reacting to it. Halfway through dinner, Vanessa approached my table carrying her bouquet, while Gerald followed behind her smiling politely at guests. "Eleanor," she said loudly enough for surrounding tables to hear, "aren't you having fun yet?" Her perfume smelled expensive and sharp. I looked up calmly. "I'm fine." "Good," she said brightly. Because tonight is about happiness, and I really don't want any negativity. Negativity. The word hung there between us while several nearby guests suddenly found their mashed potatoes fascinating. Then Vanessa leaned slightly closer, her smile never moving. Honestly, I almost didn't invite you after everything. I blinked slowly. Everything. You know, she said with a soft laugh. The way you always make things awkward. Before I could answer, my mother appeared beside her. Vanessa, sweetheart, the photographer needs you. Then she glanced toward me briefly. Try not to sit alone all night, Eleanor. People will think something's wrong. Something inside me almost laughed at that. People already knew something was wrong. They had watched it happen from the moment I walked into the ballroom. Vanessa disappeared back toward the dance floor while applause erupted for the newlyweds preparing for their first dance. I remained seated for another 10 minutes pretending to watch them sway beneath the chandeliers while guests filmed on their phones. Then quietly, without interrupting anyone, I stood and slipped out of the ballroom. The hallway outside felt wonderfully silent compared to the music and forced laughter behind me. I exhaled slowly for what felt like the first time all evening. My hotel room was on the 14th floor. I rode the elevator alone, staring at my reflection in the mirrored walls. My silver hair was still neatly pinned, my navy blue gown still perfectly pressed. From the outside, I looked composed, dignified even, but my chest felt hollow in a way I couldn't fully explain. When the elevator doors opened, I walked down the quiet carpeted hallway toward room 1418 and slid my key card into the lock. The light flashed red. I frowned and tried again. Red. A third time. Nothing. I stood there confused until I heard soft footsteps behind me. I turned to find a young woman in a black event planner suit, holding a clipboard tightly against her chest. She looked nervous. Mrs. Whitmore? She asked carefully. Yes. Her eyes darted down the hallway before returning to mine. I'm so sorry, she whispered. Your sister asked the front desk to deactivate your room access an hour ago. For a moment, I simply stared at her. The hallway suddenly felt colder than before. I'm sorry. The young woman swallowed hard. She said you weren't supposed to stay overnight after the reception. I looked down at the useless key card still resting in my hand. Then slowly, very slowly, I smiled. The young wedding planner stood in the hallway, twisting the edge of her clipboard so tightly that I thought it might snap in half. She could not have been older than 25. Her blonde ponytail was beginning to slip loose from what had probably been a very long day, and there was something deeply uncomfortable in her expression. Not rude, not careless, guilty. Mrs. Whitmore, she said quietly, I really am sorry. I argued with the front desk about it, but your sister was very specific. I looked down again at the useless key card resting in my palm. The gold lettering of the hotel logo suddenly seemed ridiculous to me. 14 floors above the wedding reception, dressed in a navy blue gown and pearl earrings, and I still somehow felt like the unwanted little girl standing outside the house, while everyone else stayed warm inside. What exactly did my sister say? I asked calmly. The planner hesitated. She said the room was no longer needed after the reception ended. I nodded slowly. Of course she did. Vanessa never liked direct cruelty. She preferred polished cruelty, elegant cruelty, the kind wrapped inside reasonable words and smiling explanations so that anyone watching from the outside would think you were overreacting if you got hurt. Do not worry about it, I said softly. This is not your fault. Relief flickered briefly across the young woman's face, though it vanished almost immediately. There is something else, she admitted. I probably should not say this, but after what happened downstairs, she lowered her voice further. The place card was intentional. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Somewhere down the hallway, an ice machine hummed softly beside the elevator lobby. I could still faintly hear the muffled bass of music traveling upward through the hotel floors from the ballroom below. I assumed that much, I replied. She swallowed hard. Your sister personally approved every seating card this afternoon. She laughed about it with a few bridesmaids while they were setting up. I stared at the carpet for several seconds, watching the intricate gold pattern blur slightly beneath my eyes. Not from tears. I had passed tears hours ago. This feeling was older than crying. Colder. The planner shifted uncomfortably beside me. There is a small hospitality suite on the 12th floor, she said quickly. It is usually reserved for event staff, but no one is using it tonight. I can get you inside if you would like somewhere private to sit. I looked up at her then. Kindness from strangers always startled me more than cruelty from family. Cruelty had become predictable years ago. "Thank you," I said. "That would be lovely." She led me silently toward the elevator while guests in formal clothes drifted in and out of nearby rooms laughing loudly about the wedding. One older couple stepped aside politely to let us pass. They smiled at me without recognizing who I was. I wondered if they had laughed downstairs too. Probably. Most people laugh when everyone else does. The hospitality suite was small but beautifully furnished, with soft gray couches, a coffee station, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago glowing beneath the summer night sky. The planner unlocked the door and handed me a temporary access card. "You can stay here as long as you need," she said gently. "Thank you," I repeated. She hesitated near the doorway. "For what it is worth," she added quietly, "I do not think you deserved any of this." After she left, the room fell completely silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. I sat down slowly beside the windows and removed my heels one at a time, setting them neatly beside the couch. My feet ached. At 67, formal events always exhausted me more than they used to, though tonight the exhaustion felt deeper than physical. I leaned back against the cushions and stared down at the city lights below. Somewhere beneath me, Vanessa was probably still dancing under crystal chandeliers while guests toasted her happiness. My mother was likely floating between tables bragging about the floral arrangements. My father was probably drinking expensive bourbon with Gerald's friends while pretending our family was perfect. And maybe that was the strangest part of all. They genuinely believed they were normal people. Good people. Family-oriented people. If someone had confronted them directly tonight, they would have looked shocked and offended. My mother would have said Vanessa was only teasing. My father would have accused me of being dramatic. Vanessa herself would probably cry and insist everyone misunderstood her intentions. The pattern had existed so long it no longer even required effort from them. I closed my eyes briefly and memories began arriving one after another like unwelcome visitors. My 10th birthday party, when Vanessa convinced my classmates to play a game called Ignore Eleanor. Christmas morning when my parents bought Vanessa a brand new car and handed me a department store sweater while explaining finances were tight this year. The summer barbecue where Vanessa announced my husband had moved out before I had even told anyone about the separation. "I thought everybody already knew," she had said while smiling innocently across the picnic table. Always the same performance. Cruelty followed by innocence. Damage followed by denial. I stood slowly and walked toward the coffee station near the far wall. My hands were steadier now. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, even though it was nearly 11 o'clock at night. The bitter warmth grounded me slightly. That was when my phone buzzed against the marble countertop. Vanessa. For several seconds, I simply stared at her name lighting up the screen. Then I answered. "Where did you disappear to?" she asked immediately. Her voice sounded bright and breathless beneath the noise of the reception music behind her. "People are asking where you went." I almost laughed at that. "Are they?" "Eleanor," she sighed dramatically. "If this is about the place card, you are seriously overreacting." I said nothing. Silence always unsettled Vanessa more than anger. "Honestly," she continued, "it was funny. Everybody thought it was funny." "I see. Do not do this tonight," she snapped suddenly, dropping the cheerful act for half a second before recovering again. "You always ruin important moments by making everything about your feelings." I stared out the window at headlights crawling through the streets below. "Vanessa," I said quietly, "why did you deactivate my hotel room?" The line went silent. Then she laughed softly. "Oh, that. Well, Gerald and I decided to give the suite to one of his cousins. Since you left early anyway, it just made sense. Without telling me, you were obviously upset. I assumed you wanted to go home." There it was again. That polished cruelty. Calm. Reasonable. Designed to make me sound irrational if I challenged it. I took a slow sip of coffee. "You embarrassed me in front of 200 people tonight." "You embarrass yourself," she replied immediately. The coldness in her voice finally slipped free completely now. "You always have." For the first time all evening, something sharp and clear settled inside me. Not rage. Not heartbreak. Clarity. Because suddenly I understood something I should have accepted decades ago. Vanessa was never going to change. My parents were never going to defend me. The little girl inside me who kept hoping one day the family would finally love her had spent 67 years chasing something that did not exist. Are you still there? Vanessa asked impatiently. I looked down at the wedding invitation resting beside my purse on the counter. Thick cream paper, gold trim, family celebrating family. I smiled faintly to myself. Yes, I said softly. I am here. Then before she could speak again, I ended the call. After I ended the call, I stood alone beside the tall windows of the hospitality suite, holding my phone so tightly that my fingers ached. Outside, downtown Chicago shimmered beneath the summer night, like nothing ugly had ever happened in the world. Traffic moved slowly along the streets below. A police siren echoed faintly somewhere in the distance. Inside the ballroom 14 floors beneath me, my sister was probably still laughing beneath chandeliers while guests raised glasses to her happiness. I should have been devastated. Maybe part of me was. But another part felt strangely calm now, as if something old and painful had finally stopped pretending to be something else. I walked back toward the couch and sat down slowly, staring at the untouched coffee growing cold in my hands. Vanessa's words repeated themselves in my mind. You always ruin important moments. I had heard versions of that sentence my entire life. Every family holiday, every graduation, every wedding shower or birthday dinner somehow became evidence that I was difficult simply because I reacted to being hurt. My mother used to say I had a talent for making people uncomfortable. My father preferred the phrase too emotional. Vanessa simply called me exhausting. Over the years, they repeated those descriptions often enough that eventually I began believing them myself. I spent decades apologizing for my own pain. I learned how to smile through humiliation because keeping the peace mattered more than dignity in our family. Or at least it mattered more when the peace belonged to Vanessa. Around midnight, I finally stood and walked toward the small restroom attached to the suite. My makeup still looked surprisingly intact considering the evening I had survived. The woman staring back at me in the mirror looked tired but composed. Silver hair pinned neatly, pearl earrings still in place, navy blue gown without a wrinkle. I looked like a woman who had attended a lovely wedding reception. No one would have guessed that an hour earlier her own sister had publicly labeled her unwanted in front of 200 guests. I removed my earrings carefully and placed them beside the sink. My hands no longer trembled. That frightened me more than anything else. Grief usually shook me. Shame usually hollowed me out for days. But tonight, something colder had taken its place. Acceptance, perhaps. Or clarity. I splashed cool water across my face and suddenly remembered another wedding nearly 30 years earlier. My own. I had been 38 years old standing in a small church outside Milwaukee, wearing a lace gown my grandmother helped sew by hand. Vanessa had been my maid of honor. During the reception, she stood to give a toast and joked that my husband Daniel deserved a medal for agreeing to marry someone as uptight as Eleanor. Everyone laughed then too, including Daniel. I laughed with them because that was what I always did. Later that night, my mother told me I needed to stop taking things personally because Vanessa only teased people she loved. It amazed me now how often cruelty had been repackaged as affection in our family. Around 12:30, there was a soft knock at the suite door. I opened it carefully to find the young wedding planner standing there holding a small white bakery box. The kitchen was about to throw these away, she explained awkwardly. I thought maybe you had not eaten much tonight. Inside the box were 2 slices of wedding cake. White buttercream with raspberry filling. I stared at it for a moment before laughing softly under my breath. Thank you, I said. That is very kind. She stepped hesitantly into the room. I know this is probably not my place, she said carefully, but I have worked weddings for 6 years, and I have never seen a bride behave that way toward her own sister. I closed the bakery box gently and sat back down on the couch. Actually, I replied, you have probably seen people behave that way many times. Most families just hide it better. She looked uncomfortable hearing that. Young people still believed families naturally protected one another. Age teaches you differently. Can I ask you something? She said after a moment. Why did you stay so calm downstairs? I smiled faintly. Because if I had cried, they would have called me dramatic. If I had yelled, they would have called me unstable. And if I left immediately, they would have said I ruined the wedding. The planner lowered herself slowly into the armchair across from me. So what do you do instead? I looked down at the wedding cake box resting untouched in my lap. You stop giving cruel people the reaction they built the performance for. She was quiet after that. A few minutes later, she stood and apologized for keeping me awake. Before leaving, she hesitated near the door again. Your family does not deserve you, she said softly. After she left, I sat in silence for a very long time. Her words should have comforted me, but instead they exposed something deeper. Because the truth was, I had spent most of my life trying to earn love from people who had already decided I was the problem long before I was old enough to defend myself. I finally opened the bakery box and forced myself to eat a few bites of cake even though I was not hungry. Sweet raspberry filling. Vanilla sponge. Expensive and beautiful. It tasted strangely empty. Around 1 in the morning, my phone buzzed again. This time it was my mother. I stared at the screen before answering. "Where are you?" she asked immediately. No concern in her voice. Only irritation. "At the hotel." "Well, Vanessa is upset." I closed my eyes briefly. Of course she was. "I see. You disappeared in the middle of the reception," my mother continued. "People noticed. People also noticed the place card." Silence stretched across the line. Then came the sigh I knew so well. The exhausted sigh of a woman burdened by my unreasonable emotions. "Eleanor," she said carefully, "your sister was only trying to lighten the mood. By calling me unwanted, honestly, you focus on the wrong things. Vanessa has enough stress tonight without managing your feelings too." There it was. Perfectly clear. Even now. Even after everything. My humiliation had somehow become an inconvenience to them rather than a cruelty committed against me. I walked back toward the window overlooking the city. "Did you laugh?" I asked quietly. My mother hesitated. "What?" "When Vanessa held up that place card," I said softly. "Did you laugh?" Another pause. Then, I smiled because everyone else was laughing and I did not want to create tension. I almost admired the honesty of that answer. Not because it was truthful, because it revealed everything. My mother had spent her entire life protecting comfort over courage. "You know," she added quickly, "Vanessa has always been sensitive to rejection. She probably worries you do not support this marriage." I let out a slow breath through my nose. Even now, somehow, Vanessa remained the fragile one, the wounded one, the child who needed protection. "Mother," I said quietly, "did it ever occur to you that I spent 67 years feeling rejected by all of you?" The silence on the other end lasted longer this time. Then finally she replied with the same sentence she had used for decades whenever conversations became too honest. "You remember things differently than the rest of us." I looked out over the glowing city skyline and smiled to myself. Because for the first time in my life, I no longer needed them to agree with my memories in order for them to be real. After my mother hung up, I remained standing beside the window for several minutes holding the silent phone in my hand. The city lights below blurred softly against the glass while her words echoed through my mind. "You remember things differently than the rest of us." It was her favorite sentence. Her escape hatch whenever reality became inconvenient. As a child, I believed her when she said my memories were exaggerated. As a teenager, I believed her when she said I was overly emotional. By adulthood, I had learned to question my own experiences before questioning anyone else's behavior. That was how families like mine survived for so long. Not through love, through confusion, through slowly teaching one person that their pain was unreliable. I finally placed the phone face down on the table beside the untouched cake box and walked back toward the couch. The hospitality suite felt colder now. The wedding music from downstairs had faded completely. Most guests were probably returning to their rooms drunk on champagne and celebration, posting smiling photos online beneath captions about family and unforgettable memories. Tomorrow morning social media would be filled with glowing comments about Vanessa's beautiful wedding. No one would mention the woman publicly humiliated in the ballroom. Cruelty disappears easily when it ruins the aesthetic. I curled my legs beneath me carefully and leaned back against the cushions, staring at the ceiling while old memories continued surfacing one after another. It amazed me how quickly the mind reopened rooms you spent years trying to lock shut. I remembered being 12 years old at a family barbecue in our backyard outside Milwaukee. Vanessa was 7 then. My father had bought expensive steaks for guests while my mother arranged flowers across the patio tables. I accidentally dropped an entire tray of lemonade glasses while trying to help carry drinks outside. The glasses shattered across the concrete. Lemonade splashed everywhere. I still remembered the silence that followed before my mother sighed loudly in front of everyone and said, "This is exactly why we let Vanessa handle important things." Everyone laughed gently while I stood there humiliated with sticky lemonade soaking through my sneakers. Vanessa smiled beside my mother, looking pleased with herself. Later that night, she told me quietly in our shared bedroom, "Nobody trusts you because you ruin everything." I was 12 years old when I first started believing I was fundamentally disappointing. Another memory followed immediately after. High school graduation. I had finished near the top of my class and earned a scholarship to Northwestern University. My guidance counselor told me I had one of the strongest essays she had read in years. At dinner that evening, my father spent nearly the entire meal talking about Vanessa's cheerleading competition the following weekend. When one of his friends congratulated me on the scholarship, my father laughed and said, "Well, somebody in this family has to be serious since Vanessa got all the charm." Everyone chuckled warmly, while Vanessa tossed her blonde curls over one shoulder and grinned. I smiled too because that was what I always did. Pretending something did not hurt became second nature after a while. I glanced toward the digital clock beside the coffee station. 2:15 in the morning. Sleep felt impossible now. Instead, I stood and walked slowly through the suite, pausing near the window again. Far below, a few wedding guests stumbled laughing into waiting cars outside the hotel entrance. I wondered how many of them would remember me tomorrow. Probably none. To them, I had only been a strange older woman who disappeared midway through the reception after failing to appreciate a harmless joke. Families are experts at controlling narratives. They decide who is difficult, who is sensitive, who ruins holidays. And once enough people accept the story, the truth hardly matters anymore. My thoughts drifted unexpectedly toward Daniel. My ex-husband had left 12 years earlier after nearly 3 decades of marriage. For years I blamed myself entirely. Vanessa certainly did. "You smother people," she told me after the divorce papers were finalized. Daniel probably just wanted peace. At the time, I accepted that explanation because it sounded familiar. I had spent my whole life being told I was somehow too much and never enough at the same time. Too emotional, too quiet, too sensitive, too distant, too difficult. Families like mine train you to believe every broken relationship must somehow trace back to your own flaws. But several years after the divorce, Daniel called unexpectedly one afternoon. He had remarried by then and moved to Arizona. We spoke politely for nearly an hour before he admitted something that stunned me. "Your family always made me uncomfortable," he confessed quietly. "I never knew how to say it while we were married." I remembered gripping the kitchen counter in silence while he continued. "They treated you terribly sometimes, Eleanor. Especially Vanessa. And somehow you always apologized afterward." At the time, hearing someone else acknowledge it felt almost disorienting. Like discovering a language I had spoken my whole life actually existed outside my own imagination. A soft knock at the suite door interrupted my thoughts. I opened it carefully to find an older hotel employee standing. They're holding a folded blanket and pillow. "The planner downstairs asked me to bring these up for you," he explained kindly, "in case you planned on staying the night here." His name tag read Harold. Gray-haired, probably in his 70s. There was something gentle in his tired eyes. "Thank you," I said softly, taking the blanket from his arms. He glanced briefly around the suite before lowering his voice slightly. "Wedding crowd." I smiled faintly. "Something like that." He nodded as though he understood far more than I said aloud. "Big events bring out strange things in families," he replied quietly. Then after a pause, he added, "Sometimes people spend more energy performing love than actually feeling it." The sentence lingered with me long after he left. I spread the blanket across the couch and dimmed the suite lights until only the city glow illuminated the room. Then I sat back down and opened my phone almost absent-mindedly. Social media was already flooded with wedding photos. Vanessa beneath chandeliers. Vanessa kissing Gerald beneath sparklers outside the ballroom entrance. Vanessa surrounded by bridesmaids holding champagne glasses. My mother smiling proudly beside her daughter. My father dancing with guests. I scrolled silently until one photo stopped me cold. It was a group family picture taken earlier that evening before the reception officially started. Everyone stood together beneath a floral archway, smiling toward the camera. My parents, Vanessa, Gerald, cousins, extended relatives, even distant family friends from Ohio. There was a space near the far edge of the frame where I clearly should have been standing. Instead, the image had been cropped just enough to remove me entirely. I stared at it for a long moment before locking the screen again. They had not simply humiliated me tonight. They had rewritten the visual story of the family itself. And suddenly, for the first time in many years, I no longer felt confused about my place in it. I understood perfectly. The painful part was not realizing they rejected me. The painful part was finally realizing they always had. I finally fell asleep sometime after 3 in the morning, curled beneath the hotel blanket with the city lights glowing faintly across the ceiling. When I opened my eyes again, pale sunlight was slipping through the tall windows of the hospitality suite, soft and quiet, and completely indifferent to the disaster of the night before. For a few seconds, I forgot where I was. Then I saw my navy blue heels beside the couch and remembered everything at once. The place card, the laughter, the phone calls, the photographs without me in them. My chest tightened briefly before settling back into that same cold calm that had followed me through the night. I sat up slowly and glanced toward the digital clock near the coffee station. 8:17 in the morning. Somewhere downstairs, guests were probably gathering for the farewell brunch Vanessa had spent months planning. I could already picture it perfectly. White tablecloths, fresh pastries, smiling speeches about family. Vanessa loved events that looked beautiful from the outside. I walked quietly into the restroom and studied my reflection in the mirror again. I looked older this morning. Not weak exactly, just tired in a deeper way than lack of sleep could explain. I washed my face carefully, pinned my silver hair back into place, and reapplied lipstick with steady hands. Habit, dignity, armor. My mother used to say appearance mattered because people judged women harshly once they reached a certain age. What she never understood was that the people who judged me most harshly had always been standing inside my own family. I was fastening my earrings when my phone buzzed again on the counter. This time the name on the screen surprised me. Sophie Whitmore. I blinked at it for a moment before answering. Sophie was Vanessa's stepdaughter from Gerald's first marriage. 28 years old. Quiet. Thoughtful. The kind of young woman who always looked slightly uncomfortable at large family gatherings. We had never been especially close, but unlike the rest of the family, she had always treated me with careful kindness. Hello. I answered softly. There was hesitation on the other end before she spoke. Aunt Eleanor? Her voice sounded nervous. I hope I did not wake you. No, sweetheart. I am. Awake. A brief silence followed. Then she exhaled shakily. I wanted to apologize. I leaned against the counter slowly. For what? For last night, she whispered. I saw what happened. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Not because of the humiliation itself, because someone had finally acknowledged it without minimizing it first. Sophie continued before I could answer. I tried to say something to Vanessa afterward, but she told me I was being dramatic and that you always play the victim. I closed my eyes briefly. Of course she did. You do not owe me an apology, I said gently. You did not do anything wrong, but I should have said something sooner. Her voice cracked slightly now. Honestly, and Eleanor, they have been talking about you horribly for weeks. I straightened slowly. What do you mean? Another pause. Can we meet somewhere private? She asked quietly. Not at the hotel. 40 minutes later, I sat across from Sophie inside a small coffee shop 3 blocks from the hotel entrance. The morning crowd moved quietly around us, while soft jazz played through overhead speakers. Sophie looked exhausted. Her dark blonde hair was pulled into a loose bun, and she kept twisting the paper sleeve around her coffee cup without drinking from it. I almost did not call you, she admitted. But after last night, I could not pretend anymore. I stirred cream into my coffee silently, waiting. Sophie glanced toward the windows nervously before lowering her voice. Vanessa has been making jokes about you for months, she said. Not just harmless teasing. Mean things. I felt strangely detached hearing it spoken aloud. Not shocked. Just tired. What kind of things? Sophie swallowed hard. She calls you the family burden sometimes. She says you drain energy out of every room. Last month at dinner, she told Gerald you have spent your whole life trying to make people feel guilty for not loving you enough. I looked down at the steam rising from my coffee cup. The words hurt less than they should have. Maybe because they sounded so familiar. Maybe because some part of me had always known. Sophie continued quietly. The wedding planner did not make a mistake with your place card. Vanessa designed it herself. She thought it would be hilarious. Around us, coffee cups clinked softly against ceramic plates while strangers chatted about ordinary things. Outside, a city bus hissed to a stop at the corner. The world kept moving normally, while something inside me slowly rearranged itself. Did my parents know? I asked finally. Sophie looked away immediately. That answered the question before she even spoke. Your mother saw the card during setup yesterday afternoon, she admitted softly. I heard her laugh. I stared at her for several seconds without speaking. Sophie's eyes filled with guilt almost immediately, as though she regretted telling me. But strangely, I did not feel angry with her. Only relieved. Relieved to finally stop questioning my own instincts. Sophie leaned forward suddenly. There is something else you need to know. Her voice dropped lower now. The only reason Vanessa invited you to the wedding at all is because Gerald's attorney said the estate paperwork would look suspicious if immediate family members were excluded. I frowned slightly. Estate paperwork. Sophie nodded. Gerald and Vanessa are trying to secure financing for a new property in Aspen. A very expensive one. Apparently, the banks are reviewing trust documentation connected to your grandfather's estate. My fingers tightened slightly around the coffee cup. And what does that have to do with me? Sophie hesitated again. I do not know everything, she admitted. But I overheard Gerald arguing with Vanessa 2 weeks ago. He said if you refused to sign certain trust renewal documents after the wedding, their financing could collapse. For a moment, the sounds inside the coffee shop seemed to fade into the background completely. I sat very still, processing her words carefully. Trust renewal documents. Aspen property financing. My grandfather's estate. Pieces of old conversations began clicking together quietly in my mind. Family phone calls over the last year asking whether I had reviewed updated legal paperwork. My mother repeatedly encouraging me to stop being difficult about financial meetings I barely remembered scheduling. Vanessa, suddenly becoming unusually pleasant every time the subject of family trust surfaced. Sophie watched my expression carefully. Aunt Eleanor, she asked softly, did you know something about this? I slowly set my coffee cup down. Outside the window, sunlight reflected brightly across passing cars while pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks carrying shopping bags and briefcases. Normal life. Ordinary life. And suddenly, beneath all the humiliation of the last 24 hours, I sensed something else entirely. Fear. Not mine. Theirs. Because for the first time since arriving in Chicago, I finally understood something important. Vanessa had not invited me to the wedding because she wanted reconciliation. She invited me because she needed something from me. And if that was true, then maybe I was not as powerless in this family as they had spent decades teaching me to believe. After Sophie left the coffee shop, I remained seated by the window long after my coffee had gone cold. Outside, the late morning sunlight spilled across downtown Chicago in bright gold reflections, and people hurried past carrying shopping bags and takeaway cups as though nothing complicated had ever happened in their lives. I envied them briefly, not because their lives were perfect, because they probably trusted the people who claimed to love them. Sophie's words continued circling quietly in my mind. She invited you because she needed something from you. I looked down at my hands resting on the small cafe table. Age had changed them over the years. Thinner skin, more visible veins, but they were still steady. That surprised me. 20 years ago, learning my family used me would have shattered me emotionally. But now the truth simply settled into place beside all the other truths I had spent years avoiding. Vanessa had never wanted reconciliation. My parents had never wanted peace. They wanted access, control, compliance. And suddenly the entire wedding looked different in retrospect. The invitation arriving after nearly 8 months of silence. My mother repeatedly insisting how important family unity was. Vanessa suddenly calling me sweetheart during rehearsals after barely speaking. To me, for years, none of it had been genuine warmth. It was preparation. I slowly reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. There were already 6 missed calls from my mother and 3 messages from Vanessa. I ignored all of them and instead searched for another contact entirely. Martin Keller, our family attorney. My grandfather hired Martin nearly 30 years ago, shortly before his death, and after that he became quietly woven into every major financial decision involving the Whitmore estate. I had not spoken to him directly in almost a year. My thumb hovered over his number for several seconds before I pressed call. He answered on the second ring. Eleanor. His voice sounded genuinely surprised. Everything all right? I almost laughed at the question. Actually, I replied softly. I think I finally need to understand what exactly my family has been trying so hard to make me sign. Silence followed briefly. Not uncomfortable silence. Careful silence. Where are you? He asked finally. Chicago. Another pause. Can you meet me this afternoon? By 1:30, I was seated inside Martin Keller's office overlooking the Chicago River. The building was modern and understated, all glass walls and quiet carpets designed to make wealthy people feel discreetly important. Martin himself looked older than I remembered, more gray in his hair, deeper lines around his eyes. But his expression remained calm and deliberate, the same way it had been since I first met him after my grandfather's funeral decades earlier. He placed a thick folder carefully on the desk between us before sitting down across from me. I had a feeling this conversation might happen eventually, he admitted. I folded my hands in my lap. Then perhaps you should start from the beginning. Martin studied me for a long moment. How much do you currently know about the Whitmore Family Trust? Very little, I answered honestly, which now feels intentional. He exhaled slowly through his nose. Your grandfather established the trust shortly before he passed away in 1996. Most family members assumed the primary beneficiaries would eventually be your parents, and, after them, both daughters equally. But, Martin leaned back slightly in his chair. But your grandfather amended the structure 6 months before his death. Something inside me tightened quietly. Why? Martin hesitated before answering carefully. Because he trusted you more. I stared at him without speaking. He opened the folder slowly and turned several documents toward me. Legal forms, trust agreements, amendments, signatures. My grandfather's familiar handwriting across the margins. Your grandfather believed you were the only family member responsible enough to protect the estate long-term, Martin explained. He appointed you sole trustee and executor over several major trust divisions. I blinked slowly. Sole trustee. Martin nodded. Your parents receive distributions. Vanessa receives distributions. But final authority over major asset restructuring remains yours. The office suddenly felt strangely quiet around me. I looked down again at the documents spread across the desk. My signature appeared beside several amendments I barely remembered approving over the years. Routine renewals. Administrative authorizations. Nothing dramatic. Nothing suspicious. Because no one ever wanted me looking too closely. And the Aspen property? I asked quietly. Martin removed another file from the folder. Vanessa and Gerald are attempting to leverage portions of the trust as collateral for a $42 million real estate acquisition. I stared at him. $42 million? The lenders require updated authorization from all controlling trustees, he explained calmly, which means they require your signature. Suddenly, every piece of the wedding snapped together with cold precision. The forced invitations, the sudden friendliness, my mother insisting family appearances mattered, Vanessa tolerating my presence long enough to secure paperwork afterward. I felt something almost like embarrassment wash through me then. Not because they manipulated me, because part of me had still hoped, even now, that maybe some tiny piece of their invitation came from genuine reconciliation. Martin watched my expression carefully. I assume, he said gently, something happened at the wedding. I let out a quiet breath. My sister introduced me to 200 guests as an unwanted guest. For the first time since arriving, Martin looked openly disturbed. Good God. Then she deactivated my hotel room. His jaw tightened slightly. Eleanor, please do not pity me, I interrupted softly. I simply want the truth now. Martin remained silent for several seconds before nodding once. The truth, he said carefully, is that your family has relied heavily on your reluctance to challenge them, financially and emotionally. I looked out toward the river through the office windows. Boats drifted slowly across the water below, while sunlight flashed against nearby buildings. Did my grandfather know what they were like? I asked quietly. Martin's expression softened unexpectedly. Your grandfather loved you very much, he said. And yes, I believe he understood more than he admitted aloud. Something painful moved quietly through my chest at those words. My grandfather had been the only family member who ever made me feel safe growing up. When Vanessa mocked me at dinner tables, he changed the subject. When my mother criticized me unfairly, he defended me gently without creating scenes. After he died, the house felt colder almost immediately. I lowered my eyes back toward the trust documents spread across the desk. What happens if I refuse to sign? Martin answered carefully. The Aspen financing collapses immediately. Several additional investment projects connected to Gerald's business partnerships may also become unstable. And Vanessa knows this? Very much so. I sat back slowly in the leather chair, absorbing the full weight of it. For 67 years, my family treated me like the least important person in every room. Too emotional, too difficult, too weak. And all along, the future they wanted financially depended on the very woman they spent decades humiliating. The irony would have been funny if it did not hurt so much. Martin folded his hands calmly atop the desk. "Eleanor," he said gently, "you do not need to make any decisions today." But as I looked down at my grandfather's signature beside my own name on the trust documents, I realized something important for the very first time. Maybe the real problem was not that my family never valued me. Maybe the real problem was that I had spent my whole life pretending not to see it. When I left Martin Keller's office later that afternoon, Chicago no longer felt quite the same to me. The city itself had not changed, of course. The sidewalks were still crowded with office workers carrying iced coffees and talking into wireless headsets. Taxis still honked impatiently at intersections while tourists wandered near the river, taking photographs beneath the bright July sun. But something inside me had shifted quietly and permanently during the last 2 hours. For the first time in my life, I understood exactly why my family tolerated me instead of discarding me completely. They needed me useful. And usefulness, I realized bitterly, was the closest thing to love they had ever offered me. I walked slowly along the riverfront with my purse tucked beneath one arm and Martin's folder held tightly against my chest. The folder felt heavier than paper should. 40 years of legal structures. Financial authority I barely understood. Decisions my grandfather made long ago because somewhere deep down he saw what I refused to see in myself. I stopped briefly beside the railing overlooking the water and closed my eyes against the warm afternoon breeze. My grandfather used to bring me fishing near Lake Geneva when I was little. Vanessa hated those trips because she thought they were boring, but I loved them. He would sit quietly beside me for hours without demanding conversation or performance. Sometimes we barely spoke at all. At the time, I thought that was what peace felt like. Looking back now, I realized it was what safety felt like. My phone buzzed again inside my purse. This time it was my father. I stared at his name for several seconds before answering. "Hello, Dad. Where are you?" he asked immediately. No greeting. No concern. His tone carried that familiar sharpness he used whenever he felt inconvenienced. "Downtown. Your mother is upset." I almost smiled at how predictable that was. Somehow, after everything, my absence remained more offensive. Then Vanessa's cruelty. "I see." He exhaled heavily into the phone. "Vanessa is trying to enjoy her honeymoon brunch, and everybody keeps asking where you disappeared to last night." I looked out across the river while sunlight reflected sharply off the water. "That sounds difficult for her." Silence. Then his voice hardened slightly. "Do not start with the sarcasm." I closed my eyes briefly. Even now, even after public humiliation, even after being locked out of my hotel room, I was still the problem because I disrupted comfort. "Dad," I said carefully, "did you know Vanessa planned that place card?" Another pause. Not shocked, not confused, just calculating. "It was a joke," he replied finally. "People tease each other at weddings." "Did you know?" I repeated quietly. His patience thinned immediately. "You always do this, Eleanor. You take one little thing and turn it into some giant emotional trial." I leaned more heavily against the railing beside the river. "One little thing," I repeated softly. "Is that what you call publicly labeling your daughter unwanted?" "Oh, for God's sake," he snapped. "Nobody thinks you are unwanted." I let the silence stretch between us, because we both knew that was not true. He lowered his voice slightly after a moment, trying to sound reasonable now. "Listen, Vanessa is emotional today. Weddings are stressful. You know how sensitive she is." There it was again. Vanessa's emotions mattered. Mine created inconvenience. "Dad?" I asked quietly. "Has there ever been a moment in your life when you defended me instead of explaining her behavior?" The line went completely silent. I could almost hear him searching backward through decades for an answer that did not exist. Finally, he sighed impatiently. "I am not doing this with you today." Then he added the sentence that somehow summarized my entire childhood in one breath. "You have always been jealous of your sister." I looked down at the river below, while something inside me settled completely still. Not angry, not wounded, just finished. Because suddenly I understood that no explanation would ever matter to people invested in misunderstanding you. "I hope Vanessa enjoys her brunch," I said calmly. Then I ended the call before he could respond. For several moments, I simply stood there beneath the bright afternoon sun listening to boats drift slowly across the water. My hands no longer shook after conversations with my parents. That realization felt strange. For years, even the smallest criticism from them could unravel me emotionally for days. But once you finally see the pattern clearly, manipulation begins losing its power. I started walking again without any destination in mind. Around me, Chicago moved with steady summer energy. Couples laughed outside cafes. Office workers hurried across intersections. Somewhere nearby, a street musician played soft jazz on a saxophone beneath an overpass. Ordinary life continued while my entire understanding of my family quietly collapsed into something colder and more truthful than before. By late afternoon, I found myself standing outside the Grand Crescent Hotel again. For several minutes I remained on the sidewalk staring up at the tall glass building reflecting clouds across its surface. Somewhere inside, Vanessa was probably posing for farewell photographs before leaving for Aspen with Gerald. I imagined her smiling brightly while guests complimented the wedding. Maybe she already believed the situation with me was over. Buried. Another uncomfortable scene Eleanor created before disappearing quietly again. The thought almost made me laugh. I finally walked into the lobby. The marble floors gleamed beneath soft lighting while guests wheeled luggage carts toward the entrance. No one looked at me twice. I crossed slowly toward the elevators, but before I reached them, I heard someone call my name softly behind me. Mrs. Whitmore? I turned to see the young wedding planner from the night before hurrying across the lobby toward me. She looked relieved when she reached me. I was hoping you might come back, she admitted. I needed to give you something. Confused, I watched her pull a folded piece of paper from beneath her clipboard. One of the catering staff found this near the bridal suite after the reception ended. She explained carefully. I thought you should probably see it. I unfolded the paper slowly. It was a seating chart draft from the wedding reception. Several names had handwritten notes beside them in blue ink. Dietary restrictions, table adjustments, last-minute changes. Then near my own name, in unmistakable handwriting, I saw a sentence scrawled across the margin. Put her near the back. She thrives on pity when people notice her sitting alone. Beneath it was Vanessa's signature flourish. My fingers tightened around the paper. Not from shock. From clarity. Because there it was in plain ink at last. Not misunderstanding. Not teasing. Not family stress. Deliberate humiliation carefully planned in advance. The planner watched my face nervously. I am sorry, she whispered. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into Martin's folder beside the trust documents. No, I said quietly. Do not be. For the first time in my life, evidence no longer lived only inside my memory. And somehow that changed everything. That evening, I checked into a small boutique hotel several blocks away from the Grand Crescent. The room was modest compared to the luxury suite Vanessa and Gerald reserved for their wedding guests, but the silence felt honest there. No chandeliers. No fake smiles. No carefully polished cruelty hiding beneath expensive floral arrangements. Just a quiet room overlooking a narrow Chicago side street where rain had started falling softly against the windows by sunset. I sat alone at the small wooden desk with Martin's folder open in front of me and read through the trust documents for nearly 2 hours. Every page revealed another detail my family had quietly depended on me never fully understanding. My grandfather had not simply made me a symbolic trustee. He gave me real authority. Authority over estate restructuring. Authority over asset liquidation. Authority over property-backed financing agreements. Which meant one thing very clearly. Vanessa and Gerald could not secure their Aspen purchase without me. I leaned back slowly in the chair and stared toward the rain sliding down the hotel windows. For decades, my family treated me like background noise. The difficult sister. The overly emotional daughter. The embarrassing relative. People tolerated out of obligation. And yet behind closed doors, the future they envisioned financially depended on my signature. The contradiction sat heavily in my chest. My phone buzzed shortly after 7 o'clock. Another message from my mother. Eleanor, please stop creating unnecessary drama. Vanessa is devastated by your behavior. I read the message twice before quietly placing the phone face down on the desk again. Devastated. The word almost fascinated me. My sister publicly humiliated me, erased me from family photographs, mocked me in front of 200 guests, deactivated my hotel room, and somehow she remained the victim in my mother's mind because I refused to pretend everything was normal afterward. The emotional mathematics inside families like mine always worked that way. The person reacting to cruelty became more offensive than the cruelty itself. I stood slowly and walked toward the small coffee machine beside the dresser. Outside, headlights blurred across the rain-darkened street while distant thunder rolled faintly beyond the city skyline. As I poured coffee into a ceramic mug, another memory surfaced unexpectedly. I was 19 years old, home from college during Thanksgiving break. Vanessa had invited several friends over after dinner, and at some point the conversation turned toward careers and future plans. I mentioned wanting to study law after graduation. Vanessa laughed immediately and announced to the entire room, "Eleanor cannot even order pizza without apologizing to the delivery guy." Imagine her in a courtroom. Everyone laughed. My father laughed hardest. Later that night, my mother told me I needed thicker skin because Vanessa was naturally charismatic and people enjoyed her sense of humor. I remembered abandoning the idea of law school only months later. At the time, I convinced myself it was because I lacked confidence. Now I wondered how much of my life had quietly shrunk beneath years of ridicule disguised as personality. A soft knock at the hotel room door interrupted my thoughts. I frowned slightly before opening it carefully. Sophie stood in the hallway holding a paper takeout bag beneath one arm. "I hope this is not strange," she said awkwardly. "You mentioned earlier that you had not really eaten since yesterday." I stared at her for a second before stepping aside silently to let her enter. The smell of soup and fresh bread filled the room almost immediately as she placed the bag on the desk beside the trust documents. "There is tomato soup and grilled cheese," she explained nervously. Comfort food felt appropriate. Something inside my chest tightened unexpectedly. Such a small gesture. But tenderness feels enormous when you spend years starving for it. "Thank you," I said quietly. Sophie glanced down at the folder spread across the desk. "You met with Martin." It was not a question. I nodded once. She lowered herself carefully into the chair near the window while I sat across from her, holding the warm soup container between my hands. "I always knew something strange existed around the family finances," she admitted softly. "Vanessa becomes almost paranoid whenever your name comes up during legal conversations." I stirred the soup slowly without eating. "Did she ever explain why?" Sophie gave a humorless little laugh. "Vanessa does not explain things. She controls narratives." The accuracy of that sentence nearly made me smile. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the room settled into comfortable silence for a moment. Then Sophie spoke again, more carefully this time. "Can I ask you something honestly?" "Of course." She hesitated briefly before meeting my eyes. "Why did you keep trying with them for so long?" The question sat between us quietly. Not judgmental, just sincere. I looked down at the steam rising from my soup. "Because they were my family," I answered after a long pause. "And when people spend your whole life teaching you that love must be earned, you never stop trying to earn it." Sophie's expression softened painfully. "That sounds exhausting." I let out a quiet breath. It was. For several moments, neither of us spoke again. Then Sophie reached into her purse slowly and removed her phone. "There is something else you should probably see." She turned the screen toward me. It was a social media post Vanessa uploaded less than an hour earlier. A polished wedding photo beneath glowing lights. Vanessa smiling in Gerald's arms. My parents beside them laughing beautifully for the camera. Beneath the image was the caption, "Perfect weekend surrounded by everyone who truly matters." My eyes moved slowly across the words. Everyone who truly matters. There it was again. The same message repeated endlessly throughout my life in slightly different forms. You do not belong. You are tolerated, not cherished. You are useful, not loved. Sophie watched my face carefully. "I am sorry," she whispered. But strangely, I no longer felt the sharp sting I expected. The pain remained, of course, but underneath it now existed something stronger than hurt. Clarity. Clear enough that I could finally see my family without the fog of hope distorting them into kinder people than they actually were. I handed the phone back quietly. "Do you know what the strangest part is?" I asked softly. Sophie shook her head. I looked toward the rain-darkened windows. If Vanessa had simply ignored me all these years, it probably would have hurt less. Sophie frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" I folded my hands carefully around the warm mug. "Cruelty requires attention," I said quietly. And sometimes I think humiliating me became the one thing that made her feel important. The room fell silent again, except for the rain. Then Sophie said something so quietly I almost missed it. I think she has been jealous of you for years. I looked up immediately. Of me? Sophie nodded slowly. You survived things without becoming cruel yourself. Her words settled heavily in the room between us. Outside, thunder rolled softly beyond the skyline, while I sat staring at the untouched grilled cheese sandwich on the desk, beside legal documents worth millions of dollars. And for the first time in my life, I began wondering whether the version of myself my family spent decades describing had never actually existed at all. The rain continued most of the night, tapping softly against the hotel windows, while Sophie eventually fell asleep in the armchair near the corner of the room. I covered her carefully with the extra blanket Harold had brought earlier and returned to the desk beside the window where Martin's documents still lay spread open beneath the warm lamplight. Outside, Chicago glowed silver and gold beneath the storm clouds, while traffic moved slowly through wet streets far below. I should have felt exhausted after everything that happened during the last 2 days. Instead, I felt painfully awake, like someone who had spent decades asleep inside her own life, and suddenly opened her eyes all at once. I sat there for hours reading every page Martin gave me. Trust agreements, asset disclosures, financial projections connected to the Aspen property, Gerald's investment structures, Vanessa's projected equity position after the acquisition closed. Numbers filled page after page in cold black print. Millions of dollars depending quietly on my approval. Around 1:30 in the morning, I found a section that made me stop breathing for a moment. A supplemental restructuring agreement drafted 6 months earlier listed potential contingency outcomes if trustee authorization failed. I read the paragraph twice before fully understanding it. Without my signature, Gerald and Vanessa would lose not only the Aspen property, but several leveraged investments tied to the same financing package. If the deal collapsed publicly, it could seriously damage Gerald's business reputation with investors. I leaned back slowly in the chair, while thunder rolled faintly somewhere beyond the skyline. Suddenly, the wedding humiliation looked even more reckless than before. Vanessa had mocked the one person standing between her and financial disaster. The realization almost felt surreal. For most of my life, Vanessa treated me like someone powerless, weak, disposable, easy to embarrass because I would always stay quiet afterward. She never imagined there might eventually be consequences to underestimating me. My phone buzzed softly beside the folder. Another message from Vanessa. I almost ignored it before curiosity finally made me open it. Eleanor, enough with the dramatic disappearing act. We need to finalize brunch plans tomorrow before Gerald and I leave for Aspen. The message continued beneath it. Also, Martin said you still have not signed the revised trust authorization. Please stop delaying everything unnecessarily. I stared at the words for several seconds. No apology. No acknowledgement of what she did. Just irritation that I had become inconvenient. I looked towards Sophie sleeping quietly across the room, then back at the message glowing in my hand. Something calm settled over me then. Not revenge exactly. Just clarity sharpened into decision. I typed slowly. I will meet you tomorrow afternoon. Her response came less than 30 seconds later. Good. Finally. We will have lunch at the Langford Room at 1 o'clock. Do not be late this time. I almost smiled at the phrase this time, as though I had failed some family obligation by refusing to remain publicly humiliated at her reception. I set the phone aside again and closed the trust folder carefully. Across the room, Sophie shifted slightly in her sleep, but did not wake. Looking at her there beneath the blanket, I felt something unfamiliar. Protectiveness. Not because she was weak, because she was one of the few people in my family system who still recognized cruelty when she saw it. Families like mine survive by teaching younger generations to normalize emotional harm. Sophie somehow escaped that training. By morning, the storm had passed completely. Bright sunlight spilled through the hotel windows while the city below moved with fresh, washed energy after the rain. Sophie woke embarrassed for falling asleep in my room, but I assured her I was grateful for the company. Before leaving, she hesitated near the door with visible anxiety in her expression. Are you really meeting Vanessa today? She asked carefully. Yes. Sophie looked down briefly. Please be careful. I almost laughed softly at the seriousness in her voice. She is my sister, not a mob boss. But Sophie did not smile. Sometimes emotional cruelty damages people more quietly than obvious cruelty, she replied. Then after a pause, she added, Vanessa panics when she loses control of situations. After she left, I remained standing by the hotel window thinking about that sentence. Vanessa panics when she loses control. For years, my role in the family had been painfully predictable. I absorbed discomfort. I apologized first. I kept peace at my own expense. The moment I stopped playing that role, the entire balance shifted. Around noon, I dressed carefully for lunch at the Langford room. Cream blouse, navy slacks, simple pearl earrings. Nothing dramatic. I studied myself briefly in the mirror before leaving the room. My face looked calmer now than it had at the wedding. Older perhaps, sadder in certain ways, but steadier too. The Langford room occupied the top floor of an upscale hotel overlooking the magnificent Mile. Vanessa always preferred places designed to impress people before they even sat down. Crystal glasses, white linen tablecloths, waiters who moved silently like choreography. I arrived 10 minutes early. Vanessa and Gerald were already seated near the windows. My mother sat beside Vanessa holding a mimosa while my father scrolled through his phone impatiently. The moment Vanessa saw me approaching, her expression shifted instantly into exaggerated relief. There she is, she announced brightly enough for nearby tables to hear. We were beginning to think you planned on punishing us forever. I took my seat calmly across from her. Gerald offered me a tight, polite smile that never reached his eyes. Good to see you, Eleanor, he said. My mother leaned forward immediately. You really frightened everyone by disappearing yesterday. I almost admired how naturally she said things like that. The complete rewriting of reality required no effort anymore. Vanessa reached for her coffee cup with manicured fingers. Can we please move past all the wedding drama? She sighed dramatically. I am exhausted. I looked at her quietly across the table. White silk blouse. Diamond earrings Gerald bought her last Christmas. Perfect makeup. Perfect posture. She looked exactly like the version of herself she spent years constructing for the world. Charming. Elegant. Harmless. You called me unwanted in front of 200 people, I said calmly. My father lowered his phone immediately with visible irritation. Oh God, Eleanor. Again. Vanessa let out a sharp breath through her nose. It was a joke. You also deactivated my hotel room. Gerald shifted uncomfortably beside her now. Vanessa waved one hand dismissively. That was a scheduling issue. I held her gaze steadily. And the seating chart notes saying I thrive on pity? For the first time since I arrived, genuine surprise flickered across Vanessa's face. Small, fast, but unmistakable. Then it vanished beneath a cold smile. You went through planning materials? They were handed to me. Silence settled heavily across the table. My mother looked alarmed now. My father angry. Gerald suddenly very interested in his water glass. Vanessa recovered first, of course. She always did. Leaning back in her chair gracefully, she folded her hands and smiled with chilling calmness. You know what your problem is, Eleanor, she said softly. You have spent your whole life desperately wanting to be a victim. Around us, silverware clinked softly against expensive china while sunlight poured through the windows overlooking downtown Chicago. I looked at my sister for a very long moment. Then I reached slowly into my purse and placed Martin's trust folder carefully on the table between us. And for the first time in my life, I watched Vanessa Whitmore become afraid. The moment the trust folder touched the white linen tablecloth, the entire atmosphere around the table changed. It was subtle at first. Gerald's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly beside Vanessa. My mother's fingers tightened around the stem of her mimosa glass. My father slowly lowered his phone onto the table with the expression of a man realizing a conversation he expected to control had suddenly shifted somewhere unfamiliar. But Vanessa reacted most noticeably of all. Her smile remained perfectly in place, yet something flickered behind her eyes so quickly most people would have missed it. Fear. Tiny. Sharp. Real. What is this supposed to mean? She asked lightly, though her voice carried a tension that had not been there moments earlier. I rested one hand calmly atop the folder. It means, I said quietly, I finally understand why you invited me to the wedding. My father immediately scoffed. Oh, for God's sake, Eleanor. But he sounded less confident now, less dismissive. Vanessa leaned back slightly in her chair and crossed one elegant leg over the other beneath the table. You are embarrassing yourself, she said smoothly. Again. Around us, waiters moved silently between tables carrying plates of smoked salmon and fresh fruit, while wealthy brunch guests laughed softly over champagne cocktails. Sunlight streamed through the towering windows behind Vanessa, turning the diamonds in her earrings into tiny flashes of white light every time she moved her head. Anyone watching from a distance would have assumed we were simply another sophisticated family enjoying brunch together. That was the thing about emotional cruelty. It hides beautifully in elegant places. I opened the folder slowly and slid several documents across the table toward Gerald. Martin Keller explained the Aspen financing structure to me yesterday. Gerald's face lost color almost immediately. Vanessa looked sharply toward him before returning her attention to me. You met with Martin? She asked carefully now. Yes. Silence settled heavily over the table. My mother recovered first. Honestly, Eleanor, this is not the time or place for legal discussions. No, I replied calmly. The time for legal discussions was probably before my sister publicly humiliated the person controlling her trust authorization. My father's jaw tightened visibly. You are seriously threatening family over a joke. I turned toward him slowly. No, Dad. I am responding to decades of being treated like disposable furniture inside this family. He opened his mouth immediately, ready with another dismissal, but for once I did not stop speaking simply because someone looked uncomfortable. You laughed while Vanessa called me unwanted. I continued quietly. Mom laughed too. None of you defended me. Then you all acted offended because I refused to smile afterward. Nearby conversations blurred softly around us, while the four people at my table stared back in stunned silence. Not because they suddenly understood my pain, because I was finally saying it aloud without apologizing first. Vanessa folded her napkin carefully beside her untouched coffee cup. You always rewrite events to make yourself the victim, she said coldly. Do I? I reached into the folder again and removed the seating chart note the wedding planner had given me. Put her near the back. She thrives on pity when people notice her sitting alone. I placed it directly in front of her. Would you like to explain this instead? For the first time in my entire life, I watched my sister genuinely lose composure. Her face tightened instantly. Where did you get that? It does not matter. It absolutely matters, she snapped. Several nearby tables glanced briefly in our direction, now, before pretending not to notice. Vanessa lowered her voice immediately after realizing attention had shifted toward us. You had no right going through private planning documents. Interesting, I said softly. That is the part upsetting you. Gerald finally leaned forward, speaking for the first time since the folder appeared. Eleanor, he said carefully, I think emotions are running high on all sides right now. I almost smiled at that phrase. Emotions on all sides. Such polite language for cruelty when wealthy people wanted to avoid accountability. Your wife erased me from family photographs. I replied quietly. She labeled me unwanted in front of 200 people. Then she removed my hotel access without warning. Gerald's expression tightened uncomfortably. My mother suddenly reached across the table toward my hand. Sweetheart, she said softly in the same soothing tone she used when I was a child. Please do not destroy the family over one unfortunate misunderstanding. I looked down at her hand resting beside mine on the tablecloth. Even now, she framed my reaction as the danger rather than Vanessa's behavior itself. Mom, I asked gently, if someone treated Vanessa this way at her wedding, would you call it a misunderstanding? My mother froze. The answer sat there immediately between all of us. Of course she would not, because different rules always applied to Vanessa. My father leaned forward heavily now, irritation sharpening his voice. Enough already. What exactly do you want here? The question echoed through me quietly. What did I want? At 67 years old, I finally realized. The answer had changed. I no longer wanted apologies from people incapable of sincerity. I no longer wanted validation from people invested in misunderstanding me. And most surprisingly of all, I no longer wanted to earn love from people who enjoyed withholding it. I folded the seating note carefully and returned it to the folder. I want honesty, I said calmly. Vanessa laughed once beneath her breath. Please. You love dragging things out emotionally because it gives you attention. I looked directly at her. Then let us simplify things. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Fine. I opened the trust folder one final time and removed the unsigned authorization papers. I will not sign these. Complete silence followed. Even the tension at nearby tables seemed to still for a moment. Gerald's face went pale immediately. My father stared at me in disbelief. My mother looked genuinely frightened now. But Vanessa reacted differently. She smiled. Slow. Cold. Dangerous. You are bluffing, she said softly. No. You would never actually do something that's selfish. The irony of that sentence almost made me laugh aloud. Selfish, I repeated quietly. That is an interesting word coming from someone who invited me to a wedding only because she needed my signature. Gerald spoke quickly now, his calm mask cracking slightly around the edges. Eleanor, perhaps we should discuss this privately later. There is nothing private to discuss. Vanessa's eyes locked onto mine with sudden sharp intensity. Do you even understand what happens if this financing falls apart? Yes. Gerald has investors involved. Business partnerships. Contracts. I nodded once. Martin explained everything very clearly. My father leaned back heavily in his chair and muttered something under his breath that sounded almost like unbelievable. My mother looked close to tears now. Eleanor, she whispered, please. But I felt strangely peaceful sitting there beneath the bright Chicago sunlight pouring through the windows. Because for the first time in my life, I was not begging my family to value me. I was simply allowing their actions to have consequences. Vanessa studied me silently for several long seconds. Then very slowly, her polished expression hardened into something uglier. Something closer to the truth beneath all the charm she performed for the world. You know what? She said quietly. Maybe we were right about you all along. I met her gaze steadily. Maybe you were never looking at me clearly enough to know. Then I closed the trust folder calmly, stood from the table, and walked away while my family sat frozen in stunned silence behind me. When I stepped out of the Langford room and into the bright Chicago afternoon, I expected to feel triumphant. After all, for the first time in my life, I had finally refused to let my family humiliate me without consequence. I had looked Vanessa directly in the eye and said no. No apology afterward. No desperate attempt to smooth things over. No shrinking myself to protect everyone else's comfort. And yet as the elevator carried me down from the restaurant floor, what I felt most strongly was grief. Not fresh grief. Ancient grief. The kind that comes when you finally stop hoping people will become who you needed them to be. Outside the hotel, the summer air felt warm against my skin as traffic moved steadily along Michigan Avenue. I stood quietly near the entrance for several moments watching strangers pass by carrying shopping bags and iced coffees, while pieces of my life rearranged themselves silently inside me. Then my phone rang. Vanessa. I stared at her name glowing on the screen before answering. What? She snapped immediately. No greeting this time. No performance. Just anger stripped completely bare. I walked slowly toward a shaded bench overlooking the street. Hello to you two. Do not do this, she hissed. You think you finally have power because of some paperwork. I sat down carefully beneath the shade of a tall tree while taxis rolled past in the afternoon heat. No, Vanessa. I think I finally understand the truth. She laughed sharply into the phone. The truth? You have always lived in your own fantasy world, Eleanor. I remained silent. That unsettled her more than arguments ever did. You are seriously willing to sabotage our lives because your feelings got hurt at a wedding, she continued. Our lives, I repeated softly. Interesting choice of words. You know exactly what I mean. No, I said calmly. Actually, I do not. Because from where I am sitting, the only person who sabotaged this family was the woman who publicly called her own sister unwanted. Her breathing sharpened audibly through the phone. You are unbelievable. No, Vanessa, I replied quietly. What is unbelievable is spending 67 years convincing someone they are worthless while secretly depending on them financially the entire time. Silence crashed heavily between us. Then her voice changed. Colder now. More dangerous. You think Grandpa chose you because you were special? She asked softly. He chose you because you were easier to control. The words landed hard despite everything. Not because I believed them. Because they sounded like something she had carried inside herself for a very long time. Maybe, I answered after a moment. But he still chose me. She inhaled sharply. You smug little. Then she stopped herself abruptly. Somewhere behind her, I heard Gerald speaking in a tense low voice. Vanessa lowered her own voice immediately afterward. Listen carefully, she said. You are making an enormous mistake. I looked out at the Chicago skyline shimmering beneath the bright afternoon sun. No, I said quietly. I made the mistake decades ago when I kept begging people like you to love me properly. Then I ended the call. My hands trembled slightly afterward, but not from fear. From release. Like something locked inside my chest for years had finally cracked open enough to breathe. I remained on the bench for a long time after that, watching people, listening to city sounds drift around me, thinking about all the years I spent shaping myself into whatever version of me caused the least discomfort for others. Softer, smaller, easier to mock, easier to dismiss. My entire life had revolved around avoiding conflict inside a family that never once protected me from cruelty anyway. Around 5 o'clock, I returned to the boutique hotel and found Sophie waiting in the lobby near the front windows. The moment she saw my face, she stood quickly. How bad was it? She asked carefully. I almost smiled. Surprisingly honest. Sophie followed me upstairs to the room, carrying takeout coffee cups, while I described the lunch conversation quietly from beginning to end. She listened without interrupting, though her expression darkened more with every detail. I knew Vanessa could be cruel, she admitted softly once I finished. But this, she shook her head slowly. I do not understand how your parents keep defending it. Neither did I once. But age gives you perspective younger people do not always have yet. Because defending her became the foundation of our family dynamic. I explained quietly. If they admitted what she was really like, they would also have to admit what they allowed. Sophie sat silently with that thought for several moments. Then she looked toward the trust folder resting on the desk beside the window. Are you really not signing? I walked slowly over to the desk and rested one hand atop the folder. Through the glass beyond it, evening sunlight painted the buildings outside in deep gold. No, I answered. I am not. Sophie studied me carefully. Does it scare you? The question surprised me slightly. I thought about it honestly before answering. Not the way I expected. What scares you then? I smiled faintly without humor, realizing how much of my life I wasted trying to earn basic kindness. The room fell quiet after that. Later that evening, after Sophie left to catch her flight home, I stood alone by the hotel window watching dusk settle across Chicago. My phone buzzed repeatedly over the next hour. Messages from my mother. Missed calls from my father. One voicemail from Gerald asking to find a reasonable path forward. I ignored all of them. Around 8:30, another message arrived unexpectedly from Martin Keller. I think you should know Gerald's investors have already started calling. News about the unsigned authorization is spreading quickly. I stared at the message for a long moment before setting the phone aside again. Then slowly, almost without thinking, I walked toward the bathroom mirror. The woman staring back at me looked tired. Her silver hair slightly loosened from the day. Fine lines etched deeper around her eyes after years of smiling through hurt. But for the first time in as long as I could remember, she did not look ashamed. I touched the edge of the sink lightly and studied my own reflection. All my life, my family described me as difficult because I reacted to pain, emotional because I remembered cruelty, weak because I wanted kindness. But standing there in the quiet hotel room, while Chicago glowed beyond the windows, I finally understood something with absolute clarity. There was never anything wrong with me for wanting love from my family. The tragedy was that they treated love like something I had to earn while giving it freely to each other. And maybe the most powerful thing I had ever done was finally deciding I no longer needed their permission to believe I deserved better. 3 months after Vanessa's wedding, I stood barefoot on the porch of a small coastal rental home in Maine watching gray waves roll slowly against the rocks below the cliffs. The air smelled like salt and pine trees, and somewhere farther down the shoreline, gulls cried softly against the cold October wind. The house itself was simple. White shutters, weathered wooden floors, a narrow kitchen with windows overlooking the ocean. Nothing luxurious, nothing designed to impress anyone. And yet it was the first place I had lived in years where I could breathe without feeling judged for taking up space. I wrapped my cardigan tighter around myself and watched the tide drift inward beneath the cloudy afternoon sky. Silence no longer frightened me the way it once had. Silence used to feel like abandonment. Now it felt peaceful. My phone rested untouched on the small porch table beside a cup of tea growing cold in the wind. The screen lit up occasionally with missed calls and messages I no longer rushed to answer. My mother still sent long emotional texts insisting the family needed healing. My father preferred shorter messages demanding I stop punishing everyone over hurt feelings. Vanessa had stopped calling entirely after the Aspen financing collapsed publicly 6 weeks earlier. According to Martin, several investors pulled away almost immediately once the trust authorization failed. Gerald's reputation inside certain business circles suffered badly afterward. The Aspen property was gone. So were 2 additional development deals connected to the same financial structure. At first, I expected their anger to make me feel guilty. Instead, what surprised me most was how quiet my mind became once I stopped carrying responsibility for everyone else's choices. I did not destroy Vanessa's future. Vanessa destroyed it the moment she confused cruelty with power. A soft knock sounded behind me against the screen door. "You are going to freeze out here," Sophie said gently as she stepped onto the porch carrying another blanket. I smiled faintly as she draped it over my shoulders before sitting beside me in the rocking chair near the railing. Sophie had visited twice since I moved to Maine. Somehow, over the past few months, she became the closest thing to family I had left. Not because we shared blood, because she spoke to me with kindness instead of control. "Martin called this morning," she said carefully after a moment. I glanced toward her, and Sophie hesitated slightly. "Your parents are selling the Milwaukee house." The words settled quietly between us while waves crashed softly below the cliffs. I looked back toward the ocean. "I see." Apparently, the financial pressure became too much after Gerald's projects failed. I nodded once, but said nothing. My childhood home. The same house, where Vanessa learned how to humiliate me while my parents laughed it away as teasing. The same kitchen where I apologized for emotions no one else had to apologize for. The same dining room where my achievements became inconveniences beside Vanessa's charm. For years, I thought leaving that house emotionally meant I was weak. Now I realize surviving it at all required strength I never gave myself credit for. Sophie studied me quietly. "Do you feel sad?" she asked softly. I considered the question honestly. Not the way I expected. The truth was more complicated than sadness. It felt like standing beside the ruins of something that had been collapsing for decades, while everyone pretended the walls were stable. My parents still blamed me, of course. That part had not changed. In my mother's version of events, I abandoned the family over a misunderstanding. In my father's version, I became vindictive and selfish late in life. Vanessa told mutual relatives I destroyed her marriage out of jealousy. According to Sophie, she still insisted the wedding joke was harmless and that I overreacted because I wanted attention. But something important had changed inside me over these last months. Their versions of me no longer controlled how I saw myself. The wind shifted colder across the porch while Sophie tucked her hands beneath the sleeves of her sweater. "Can I ask you something?" she said after a while. "Anything. Do you ever wish they would apologize?" I looked out toward the dark gray water rolling endlessly against the shore. Years ago, I would have answered yes immediately. I would have admitted I still dreamed about hearing my parents finally say they failed me. I would have confessed how desperately I wanted Vanessa to look at me with genuine remorse instead of competition. But age changes certain truths. "No," I said quietly. "Not anymore." Sophie frowned slightly. "Why?" I smiled softly at the ocean. "Because apologies from people who never truly saw your pain cannot heal the damage they caused." The porch fell silent again except for the steady crash of waves below us. Somewhere inside the house, the old kitchen clock ticked softly through the open doorway. Peaceful sounds. Ordinary sounds. Sounds I spent most of my life believing I had to earn somehow. Later that evening, after Sophie left for the airport, I sat alone beside the fireplace with an old photo album resting open across my lap. Not family photographs from my parents' house. My own photographs. Pictures I had kept hidden away in storage boxes for years because looking at them hurt too much. There I was at 22 standing beside my grandfather near Lake Geneva, holding fishing poles and smiling genuinely. There I was at 35 planting flowers outside my first home with dirt on my jeans and sunlight across my face. There I was at 50 reading beside a hospital bed while caring for a friend during chemotherapy treatments. Looking through those photographs, I realized something startling. The version of me my family described for decades